The rusted iron gates of the Gooey soda factory loomed ahead, standing as a jagged barrier against the morning quiet. Serena, Pina, Harmony, and Pina moved in unison, their boots crunching against the gravel as they reached the threshold. They did not hesitate. With a synchronized push, the heavy doors swung inward, revealing a cavernous space filled with the low, rhythmic thrum of machinery. Pina reached back, gripped the iron handle, and pulled. The lock clicked into place with a final, resonant thud that echoed deep into the rafters. They were inside now, and the outside world ceased to exist. The factory floor breathed with the sound of bubbling vats and the sharp hiss of pressurized pipes. Every surface vibrated underfoot. Serena signaled the team, and they fanned out across the main entrance, their movements precise and practiced. They were here to secure the perimeter and monitor the production lines, and the factory had already begun its work. The air grew thick with the smell of sweet, synthetic vapor. They stood in the center of the humming expanse, eyes scanning the dark corners of the catwalks, waiting for the first sign of movement. The mission had officially begun. The catwalk stretched out like a steel spiderweb above the factory floor. Serena led the way, her steps rhythmic and measured against the grated metal. Below them, the vats churned with a thick, viscous liquid that pulsed in time with the factory's internal rhythm. Hours bled into one another. They moved from sector to sector, eyes darting into the deep shadows where the light failed to reach. Harmony stopped at a junction, checking the pressure gauges, while Pina kept watch over the main assembly line. The heat was constant, a heavy weight that pressed against their skin. Suddenly, a high-pressure pipe overhead hissed, venting a cloud of white steam that obscured the walkway. The team froze, hands instinctively moving to their gear. The steam dissipated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving only the sound of dripping condensation hitting the vats below. They exchanged glances, then continued their circuit. The monotony began to fray at the edges of their focus. Every bubbling vat seemed to hold a secret, and the rhythmic thumping of the pumps sounded almost like a heartbeat. The air felt charged, heavy with the scent of something sweet and unidentifiable. They paced the perimeter again, waiting for the machinery to reveal what it was hiding. The patrol slowed as the team reached the cooling station. Serena signaled for a brief rest, and the 4 guards dispersed toward the heavy steel railings. Pina leaned over the edge of a massive, open-topped vat. Inside, a thick, viscous sludge churned slowly, its surface dull and opaque. It looked like industrial waste, yet it emitted a faint, sweet aroma that defied the factory's sterile environment. She reached into her utility belt, pulled out a clean glass, and lowered it into the pool. The liquid clung to the sides of the glass, heavy and sluggish. She pulled it back up, watching the dark droplets slide down the interior. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then tilted the glass to her lips. The first sensation was thick, coating her tongue with a heavy, syrupy weight. Then, the reaction began. The sludge dissolved instantly, replaced by a violent, sharp carbonation. It was electric. The dull, heavy texture vanished, leaving behind a crisp, biting sweetness that surged through her senses. Pina pulled the glass away, staring at the vat with wide eyes. She looked at the liquid again, not as a byproduct to be monitored, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her fingers tightened around the glass, and she turned back toward the workstation. Pina moved to the workstation with a singular, driving purpose. She cleared a space, shoving aside maintenance logs and heavy tools. From a supply crate, she grabbed a beaker, her hands moving with newfound speed. She began by crushing a handful of marshmallows, the soft white pieces yielding under the pressure of her palm. She tossed them into the beaker, then reached for a canister of neon blue syrup. She poured a precise amount, watching the viscous liquid swirl around the marshmallow base. The mixture was dull, thick, and uninspiring. She paused, scanning the shelf for the final component. Her fingers brushed against a jar of stardust-colored sugar. She shook a generous dash into the beaker. The reaction was immediate. A faint hiss rose from the glass as the ingredients collided. She stirred the concoction with a metal rod, her eyes locked on the changing texture. Suddenly, The beaker pulsed. A soft, rhythmic light emanated from the base, casting long, flickering shadows against the factory wall. She grabbed a second beaker, pouring samples for Serena, Harmony, and Pina. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for their reaction. The factory manager entered the floor at dawn, his boots clicking sharply against the metal grating. He stopped at the workstation, his gaze falling on the abandoned beaker. The neon blue liquid still held a faint, residual glow. He frowned, picked up the glass, and swirled the contents. A single drop touched his tongue. He froze. The sharp, fizzy carbonation hit his palate with an intensity that made him gasp. He looked at the beaker, then back at the massive vats. He did not call a meeting. He sprinted to the main control panel, his fingers flying across the switches. The standard production sirens blared, signaling an immediate halt to all current operations. He grabbed the intercom, his voice echoing through the rafters, ordering an immediate shift to the new formula. Within hours, the bottling lines roared to life, churning out thousands of units. The crates moved onto trucks before the sun had fully risen. By the next day, the drink hit the shelves. It was not a gradual climb. It was an explosion. Consumers cleared the stock in minutes. Social media feeds flooded with images of the glowing blue liquid. Within 48 hours, the product had become a global phenomenon. The world was hooked, and the factory was now the center of a massive commercial storm. The summons arrived on a heavy, embossed card. Pina left the factory floor, trading the hum of machinery for the hushed, pressurized air of the corporate tower. She rode the glass elevator upward, watching the city shrink into a grid of lights beneath her. The doors to the boardroom slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Inside, the room was vast, dominated by a table of polished obsidian that reflected the skyline. The board members sat in silence, their eyes fixed on her. She walked the length of the room, her boots echoing against the marble floor. At the head of the table, the previous chairman stood. He did not offer a handshake. Instead, he pushed a thick, leather-bound contract across the obsidian surface. He tapped the signature line with a gold pen. Pina looked at the document, then at the faces of the directors. She reached out, her fingers closing around the pen. She signed. As the ink dried, the chairman stepped aside, gesturing toward the high-backed chair. She sat down. She was the architect of the entire operation. Pina did not rest on the success of the soda. She redirected the massive profits into a new venture, a digital studio. She paced the floor of her new office, sketching blueprints for high-speed arenas where players would wield soda cannons. Her team worked in shifts, coding the physics of the viscous liquid and the explosive recoil of the weapons. She spent nights testing the prototypes herself, firing virtual blasts at towering, monstrous targets. The mechanics were fluid, chaotic, and addictive. When the game finally went live, the impact was immediate. Servers groaned under the weight of millions of concurrent users. The game climbed to the top of every global chart within the first hour. Pina monitored the live data as the numbers surged, a vertical line of growth that defied expectations. Players across the world logged in, battling through neon-lit levels. She watched the metrics climb, the frantic energy of the launch filling the room. The transition from factory guard to industry visionary was complete. The frantic energy of the launch began to settle, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of the server banks cooling in the next room. Pina stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city lights blink in sync with the data streams on her monitors. The numbers on the dashboard were no longer climbing with the violent speed of the first hour. They were now a constant, powerful pulse of global engagement. She turned away from the glass and walked to her desk. The surface was clear, save for the glowing terminal and a single, heavy glass object. She sat down, the leather chair absorbing her weight. The silence in the office was absolute, a stark contrast to the digital chaos she had unleashed upon the world. She leaned back, eyes scanning the final metrics of the day. Every graph showed a steady, upward trajectory that refused to plateau. She tapped a key, freezing the display, and watched the cursor blink. The transition from the factory floor to this glass-walled sanctuary felt complete. She reached out, tracing the edge of the desk with her fingertips, feeling the cool, polished wood beneath her skin. The empire was stable, and the room felt perfectly still. Pina shifted her gaze from the glowing digital metrics to the corner of her desk. There, resting against a stack of quarterly reports, sat a small, simple frame. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass surface. Inside, the original handwritten note remained. The ink slightly faded, but the instructions still perfectly legible. She lifted the frame, the weight of it surprising in her hand. The office lights caught the edge of the glass. She remembered the hum of the bubbling vats, the sharp, fizzy scent, and the way the factory floor had felt. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, quiet luxury of the boardroom. She set the frame back down. The digital empire outside these walls was built on this single, accidental discovery. She traced the frame one last time, her thumb lingering over a small smudge of stardust-colored sugar. The global phenomenon, the soda, cannons, it all traced back to this one moment in the dark, rusted factory. The metrics on the screen continued to pulse, but her focus remained on the paper, the foundation of everything.